Thank you, Dean Ohm, for joining us today.
Sure,
This is one of the first installments of the GLTR interview series, if you will. So,
Good.
A little bit of your background for the people that are watching. You're the dean of, associate dean
You
for
promoted me
academic.
there for a second.
Yeah.
But okay. Yeah.
Associate dean for academic affairs and professor of law here at Georgetown Law.
Yeah.
You specialize in information privacy, computer crime law, intellectual property, and criminal procedure.
Mm-hmm.
Nice.
That's
okay,
right.
that's great. And a lot of your scholarship focuses on how evolving technology disrupts individual privacy.
Yep.
That's what we're going to be talking about today. You're commonly cited and quoted by many prominent news publications, so you're definitely a authority on the subject. So thank you again for being here with us.
Sure.
All right. So first question, we'll just dig right into it. You've written extensively about consumer privacy, but for some of the people that are tuning in that might be new to the subject, can you talk a little bit about why people should be worried about consumer privacy, and maybe how consumer privacy affects people on a daily basis?
Sure. I mean, it's we live in this complicated world of innovation, right? And this is an old story to anyone who is a citizen of this country. So every passing day sees some small improvement in a device or a service, a website or an app that makes your life better in some small way. But the kind of hidden piece of that is all of this innovation is being funded and being designed, I don't know about all of it, but almost all of it, to extract information from you, to resell that information, to store that information. And so what we have is what other scholars have called a digital dossier, that every one of us walks around with this kind of invisible portfolio of the kind of things that we never used to write down, right? The random stray things you say to your friends, that used to be done by a water cooler, and now it's recorded somewhere on a social network and is there forever. But it's not just the things you say, it's where you go, it's the choices you make. In some ways, it's really like your thoughts, right? So now, for the first time in human history, we have a business incentive to record all of your thoughts and to monetize all of your thoughts. To hold it in ways that aren't really private, and to hold it in ways that aren't terribly secure. And so the sum total of all of this, like I could go on, is that we now are being watched all the time. And so there are harms that result directly from the misuse of that information. But something that a lot of people write about that I worry about almost more is it means that we can't be ourselves. That we never have a moment off stage to just be who we want to be. Instead, we just have this perception that we're always watched. And because of that, it changes who we are. And if every one of us changes who we are in small ways, it pushes the society in different ways. So.
Okay, wow. So, that being said, with all those, those harms that are coming about from those effects, how should the United States regulate consumer privacy?
Yeah.
Are you happy with the current regime, or what are your thoughts on how things should be done?
So again, a huge question. I'll begin to go down that, but tell me if you want me to expand on any of this. So in short, no, I'm not terribly happy about the way privacy is being regulated today. The interesting thing is how in 2018, I feel like a lot of more people agree with me than maybe 5 years ago. That for a decade or so, people like me have been writing articles saying the sky is falling. A lot of other people thought it was kind of paranoid, or that we were focused on harms that were speculative, that weren't there. It turns out the sky kind of was falling all along, and now we have like a litany of examples to point to of things that have really awakened people to what's happening with their information. So let's talk about regulation. And sorry for the experts watching this in the room, this is Privacy 101, but in other countries, and most prominently in Europe, we have what we call an omnibus approach to regulating privacy. In fact, in Europe, they call it data protection, which is kind of like privacy, but kind of different. And so no matter what company, industry you're in, no matter what size of your company, no matter how many customers you have some basic fundamental obligations as a company to do things with information. The other big difference to what I'm going to talk about in the U.S. is in Europe, it's also understood that privacy is something we think of as a fundamental human right. It's on par with kind of the right to liberty and to other things here in the United States. But in Europe, privacy is on that list. All right, so let's switch gears. Here in the United States, we don't have an omnibus law. And so instead we have what's called a sectoral privacy approach, which really means it's just a jigsaw puzzle. We have, a tiny bit of law protecting health information, a tiny bit of law making it illegal to wiretap someone. We have a couple of umbrellas that spread widely, but not deeply. And so the Federal Trade Commission can police unfair and deceptive trade acts and practices. But again, that is thin and that is broad, and it isn't the kind of deep data protection model that we have in Europe. And so what you get with a jigsaw puzzle, I'm going to switch metaphors on you, is you get a patchwork. You get, this part is covered and this part is covered and this part is covered, but only when it's used for certain purposes. And so in the U.S., it's really spotty. And it means that giant companies, giant industries are almost unregulated. And so, the Google search engine is regulated by this thin layer of regulation. But when you think about the kind of importance the Google search engine has in our daily lives, it's kind of astonishing that there's so little privacy law there. So,
interesting. So at that regulatory level, do you think there should be a sole executive agency dealing with consumer privacy that would promulgate its own, eventually laws and regulations that would, cover this broad concept?
So there's two ways to answer a question like that. One is, if we could start over, what would be the ideal setup we would have for privacy regulation? And if I'm answering that question, then the answer is yeah, probably. It would make sense to have one empowered, well-run, large government agency with a lot of resources that would see it as its mission to answer all the hard privacy questions of America. That would be an improvement on what we have today. But the more pragmatic, realistic way to address a question like that is, given the kind of starting point of this sectoral patchwork, given the politics that we have in our country, would I, push for a big omnibus agency at this moment? Probably not. I think we'd be better off trying to bulk up what we do to fix the holes in that patchwork, to find ways to move our slow-moving, sclerotic political apparatus we have to create a few new laws. That might be a smarter way to go, at least in the short and midterm. In the long term, maybe we'll get to the same place, but it's not realistic to think that we're going to have an omnibus European-style privacy law in America anytime soon. And by the way, if that's what we're aiming for, then what we're going to end up with is something watered down, right? We're going to waste a lot of political energy to try and pass something that kind of sort of feels like what happens in Europe. And instead, it's going to end up being pretty unsatisfying, pretty small ball, and not nearly what we need. So,
Interesting. So going back a little bit to, you have mentioned a lot in some articles that you've written about balancing user privacy and the needs of internet service providers getting the information from users for economic reasons, for business growth reasons. How do you balance those two competing interests?
Yeah, I mean, I think the word balance is a little bit of a trap sometimes because, and a lot of other people have documented this is not original work to me, but we have a problem if we see the entire world as costs and benefits, which is a very American law school way of thinking of every problem. And so in this case, one of the problems is the costs of the kinds of harms that I'm talking about. They're diffuse, they happen far in the future, they sometimes happen in small measure to many people, and so that's the costs. And then the benefits, in contrast, are immediate, they're easy to measure, and frankly, they're kind of exaggerated, right? So the iPhone, right? You would think next to fire, the greatest thing man has ever created. And so as soon as you set up the decision as, would we rather have iPhones or would we rather have privacy? First of all, you're setting privacy up for failure. Secondly, it's a total false choice. And so I'm not Pollyanna-ish. I don't say we could have privacy and everything wonderful in innovation at the same time. I actually think in order to have meaningful privacy, we have to make hard choices and we have to give up on some things. But I want to be clear, first of all, that the balance is not the way I would approach it. But more importantly, you could have a lot more privacy than we have with just a little less innovation than we have. I think there's a lot of kind of empirical research that supports that idea. And so we have to like give up on this binary choice that we're often posed, because that's just the wrong way to think about it. Yeah.
Okay. So in your mind, what are some of the difficulties that are keeping consumer privacy from being sufficiently regulated?
Yeah, it's politics. I
Politics.
mean, it's a funny thing that in 2018, so look at something like 2016. So we had something called the Broadband Privacy Rule. It was related to net neutrality in really complicated ways. But what it said was if you're an internet service provider, you had certain limits on what you could do with user information. And oh, by the way, they weren't really limits, because you could go get user consent and still do all of that stuff. And so it took the FCC an enormous amount of energy to pass this wonderful rule. And it was actually a pretty good rule. It struck a lot of compromises. It wasn't ideal. And then something weird happened, which is we had the election. Republicans kind of took control of everything. And at that point, they decided that it became a Republican issue to oppose that rule. And I don't know if it was because it came from the Obama FCC. I'm not sure why that played out the way it did. And so within short order, they passed a resolution in Congress that basically said that rule no longer exists. It's called the CRA. And so it was just this like regrettable thing that, not being watched by your ISP suddenly became a political issue. Suddenly it was, if you're a Democrat, you could support that. If you're a Republican, you better not support that. Privacy to me doesn't feel that way. And so it's a really kind of dangerous game we're playing if suddenly we're starting to redefine privacy choices, which I think cut across party lines as a red-blue issue like everything else in our world. And so yes, politics. Politics are in the way of a lot of what we're talking about. And money. And the money that drives politics.
Sounds familiar to a lot of the other issues that we deal with. Okay, so some current protections that people can use that are out there, VPNs and anonymous browser projects. Are these type of protections enough for consumers to keep their information private if they use them correctly?
I mean, unfortunately, I'll be kind of pessimistic here. The answer is not really. I mean, the real answer is it depends on what threat you're most worried about. And so if the threat you're most worried about is that your employer is reading everything you do on the internet, and if you want to avoid that, then having a VPN that you can access from your employer will protect you from that one threat. So computer scientists talk about this as the threat model way of thinking of the world. But is the VPN going to help you? Let's focus on VPNs. From the kind of threats that like ordinary people who aren't worried about their employer deal with. Not as much as people kind of have been led to believe, for a couple of reasons. Number one, VPNs aren't great. They cost a little bit of money. They slow your connection down. They're kind of clunky to use. But more importantly, if your threat isn't your ISP is spying on you, but you're sharing too much information with social networks or with ad networks, those things can still see you through the VPN. And so again, it really depends on the threat you're trying to resolve. So although I am in strong favor of limits on broadband providers and what they can see, I don't use a VPN for the reasons I've just laid out. Like life is short. We all have countermeasures we use. We all have countermeasures that we can't be bothered to use. And I don't second guess anyone who kind of makes choices differently than me on that. So.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Sure.
And one last question. Putting aside your thoughts about how privacy should be regulated in the U.S., realistically, what do you think the future holds for consumer privacy regulation?
Putting aside my thoughts about in the U.S.
in the United States.
I mean, here I'd say, in a funny way, we've got industry, which is like a race to the bottom. Like, if they could run things, we'd have a lot less privacy than we do now. I'm painting with an awfully broad brush here, but you understand. But then you have another opportunity to have a race to the top, which is so the state of California just passed a sweeping privacy law. It's being challenged. It's being whittled down. Time will tell whether it's really going to, survive in its current form. At the same time, Europe has enacted the GDPR. The GDPR really does have some stringent requirements. It really does have some meaningful protections. So it may be that, forget about the federal government, it may be that we're going to get privacy because, if you're a company complying with California and European law, you might as well just offer the same
Yeah.
services to everyone. So to me, that's the last great hope of
Okay.
privacy. I have no hope in Congress. I don't think the answers
Yeah.
are going to lie with Congress. But if California can kind of resist the millions of dollars that are being poured into lobbying to water its law down, if the GDPR proves to be kind of honest and good stewards of the new law that they have, then it might be that our services and products progressively get better indirectly, and we're the kind of secondary side effect beneficiaries of these great laws.
Okay. So there's hope.
There's hope. Yes,
right.
there's always hope, right? Things
That's
are bleak,
good.
but there's hope.
That's
so,
good.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that's all I have for you today. Thank you
Cool.
very much. We
My
really
pleasure.
appreciate it.
Great.
Yeah.
Thanks.